Hello and welcome to a new Italian PNC video. Today we'll be looking into this beautiful map of Africa. So this is the first video I do in a long while. I've taken a long break for the summer. You know how I take breaks kinda often, honestly, but I wanted to take a summer break and then I needed a couple more months to readjust myself, but I'm back onto it, back making videos, and this will be my first video after my break. So what I'm looking at is a map of Africa. Today we'll be dwelling upon the entirety of African history in maps, and in this case specifically in post-medieval African history. But what I'm looking at is a very specific map made by Sebastian Munster. We'll be looking at specific kingdoms and states that existed in Africa according to this map. We'll be looking at possible theories that explain stuff that doesn't really make sense to the modern consensus in this map, and we'll be looking at specific examples of things that I'm talking about during this era in maps of Africa as we go. So first of all, let me just say welcome back basically, because as I said, very long pause, so it's been a while since you've heard my voice in a video, and although I wanted to make another type of video as my first video, I decided to go with this one because I had a sudden moment of inspiration sincerely, and this was just very interesting to me since I love these kind of old maps. You know how I love to cover them. I've made one that had to do with the map of the New World, that had to do with the maps of California, with the maps of Terra Nova. There's a bunch of these that I already covered in the past, and I really wanted to cover this one as well. So for those of you that might not be interested in like consensus history, you know, the one that everybody kind of accepts, I think this video could be interesting for you as well, because this really goes deep into topics that have to do with like what really people think that African history was like in the past, but like depending on the maps, you know what I mean? So there's things that, as you can see in this map, don't really make sense if you don't know the context for them, and then there's things that you know that make sense if you have the context. So first of all, you can see a couple interesting things from this map. This map has divisions in colors that seem to be something akin to political borders, but I am pretty sure this division in borders and colors was an added feature of the original map. So as I said, this original map was made by Sebastian Munster. But who is Sebastian Munster? Well, Sebastian Munster is one of the most influential cartographers of the 1500s. So in the timeline, this is the 1500s, the 16th century, so we're looking at the period right at the start of modern history, right after the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus, or you know, there's the whole deal that the Vikings discovered, whatever, I mean the like recognized 1492 date when Christopher Columbus actually arrived to the New World. That's what I'm talking about. And this map was made after that era, so that means that it was made after the Middle Ages, which were a whole other topic, but we will talk about them in short in this video as well. So first of all, what is the deal with this map? Why is this the map I want to talk about the most? Well, this is no single random map that I've taken. This is possibly the first map that shows the entirety of Africa after the African continent was circumnavigated by Europeans. What does that mean? Well, it's very simple. Before 1488, nobody actually knew what Africa looked like, or at least not in the entirety of its coastline. They knew the northern parts were somewhat like well known since ancient history. They had contacts with the areas that make up modern East Africa and West Africa, but the entire southern half, which as you can see in this map is actually very much shrunk down, was completely unknown. So this is the first time that the entirety of Africa is shown in a map with the people making it actually knowing what it would look like. There is, as we will see in the future in this video, another map that was made before this one that also showed Africa in the entirety, but when that was made there was no actual security of what was going on in the southern bit of Africa, only extending up to modern-day Ethiopia basically. That was the consensus, that was what people believed in to that point. They just thought that everything else was terra incognita, which, in case you don't know, means simply unknown land. So, you know, just the stuff that you don't really know how to show on a map. So why is this map so important, apart from being the first map that shows all of Africa? It's that it simply does not really corroborate to what we know of Africa in that time today. Like, for example, what do we have here? Extremely large mountain chains. In case it wasn't clear, these are in fact mountain chains from Egypt that go all the way to the west of Africa, all the way in what was called Barbaria, which is Morocco, and also Algeria and the entirety of the northern part of Africa. In fact, Barbaria was really just a term that was used for anything from Morocco to Tunisia, as it was the Berbers, the Berber people that were inhabiting this land before the Arabs came in during the Arab invasions. Of course, those that brought Islam with them. So the Berbers were the original people group that lived here, and they were called like that because they were basically called the same way that the Romans called everyone that wasn't really a Roman. So, as you probably already know, barbarians. The Romans came into North Africa after the conquest of Carthage, which, by the way, is right around here, Carthago, as it's known in Latin. And they just called everybody here that wasn't either Roman or Punic, which, in case you don't know, means Carthaginian. They called them barbarians. And that term, barbarian, evolved through time into Berber, which is what we still call the people of the northern parts of Africa that aren't Arab nowadays. Although modern times, the term they used to prefer is Tamazight, which basically means free men, free people, which of course is their actual native name for their own, but you're using an exonym, not an endonym in this case, although it can be considered a bit outdated. What else is shown? So we have this mountain chain that doesn't really have anything that really connects it to what we know of Africa, but can you notice something else from this map? Is something missing? Well, I know. The Sahara Desert. You know, the biggest desert that ever existed on Earth? The thing that goes from basically the entirety of West to East Africa and makes most of Northern Africa unlivable? Yeah, that thing. Where is it? Where is it in this map? You'd expect the people that, travel this area to know that there's a huge desert in it, but apparently there's nothing of the kind. Well, to be fair, I have to stop myself because clearly there is a mention of a desert here, which is right here, Libya Desertum, which of course means the desert of Libya. Okay, now you might ask yourself, where is that just the desert of Libya? What does that have to do with Africa, and why would that be the entirety of the Sahara? Well, quick information. Libya is the way that the people in the Middle Ages and even parts of the modern era called the entirety of Africa. In fact, the terms Africa and Libya were switched around the end of the modern era to distinguish different parts of Africa differently. What I'm talking about is the fact that Africa used to refer only to the parts of modern-day Tunisia, parts of Libya, as we intend the country, and parts of Algeria in the past, while Libya was to intend the entirety of the continent, or at least what was known of the continent. Then there was a third denomination, which was Ethiopia, as is written right here, Ethiopia. That was used basically to intend everything under what was already known by the people of the time. In this case, clearly we're talking about the Europeans. So Ethiopia was basically everything south of, if I want to say, maybe this Libya Desertum, so what could be considered the Sahara, while everything north was called Libya. And then Africa, as shown right here, was only the small area that included Tunisia, as is seen here, Regno Tunis, which just means the Kingdom of Tunis, then Carthage, and the places that are modern-day Libya. So when we see Libya Desertum, we shouldn't intend it as simply a desert in Libya, we should instead intend it as a desert in Africa. A way larger desert. But then comes an issue. Why is it so small? This is right here, Libya Desertum. Even if we intend everything in white to be the part of the Libya Desertum, we're still only talking about something like this. This is way smaller than what we actually know the Saharan desert to be like. And we know that the desert has been expanding for centuries and millennia, even up to 10,000 BCE. And I will be talking about that a bit more in the later parts of this video. But now let's get back to the simple concepts of the map. As I said, very interesting map, includes all of Africa. But is that it? Are there any other maps that show these intriguing parts of the map that I've been mentioning so far? Well, yes, actually. For instance, we have the map of Leonhard Holl. So Leonhard Holl was another map maker. He was a map maker that created a map of Africa even earlier than Sebastian Munster. In fact, Leonhard Holl made a map of Africa in 1482. We can see here the biggest difference between his map and the map of Sebastian Munster being very, very evident. Where is the southern half of Africa? It's just not there. As you can see, people back then, this was 6 years before the first circumnavigation of Africa, didn't know what was going on in the southern bit of Africa. 6 years before the circumnavigation, which was led by Bartolomeu Dias, a Portuguese explorer that finally went all across the Cape. So, as you can see, we don't really have a southern part of Africa, but what we do have is things that do have the same stuff that are on the map of Sebastian. As you can see, there are indeed these mountain chains that traverse what would be considered the Sahara, and they're even bigger than shown on the map of Munster. There's no interruptions with this river, for example, it just goes on and on and on until Egypt. Furthermore, the desert doesn't really even appear on this map, or if it does, it really is just very, very small. We see a net of rivers that connect basically what would be considered the Sahara together, and lakes and like aquifers. We see something that is really not apparent when we think of Africa today. You know, the whole thing about Africa not having water? Well, what's up with that in this map? This is even worse when compared to what we saw in this one. But that's not it, we even have a third map we can take information from. And this is the map that was made even before the last one. This was made in 1450 by Fra Mauro, and it's right here. So what you will notice from this map is obviously that you have no idea what is going on. Unless you've already seen this map, this is complete nonsense, right? Well, before you think of that, we actually have to do a simple change on the map. Okay, if you didn't figure it out, the map was just in reverse, and was bottom up. Now that I focus into it, you can see that this is Europe, this is Italy, this is Great Britain, this is Denmark, this is Turkey, Greece, Spain, and so on and so forth. And of course, this is Africa. But if this map was made in 1450, how come does it show the entirety of Africa? Well, the answer is very simple. They really did not know what was going on here. In fact, if we went back and re-put it back upside down, you'd see that the descriptions of this area are very vague and don't really, connect to any proof or sources. They're more like second-hand sources that the map maker did use, which is Fra Mauro. As you can see, we do have an island here, which could be considered as Madagascar. This could be the Cape, but there's no mention of the Cape, and after that, we don't really know what is going on here. We do see the word Ethiopia right here being used throughout the entirety of the southern half of Africa, because that was just what everything like that was called. What we do notice from this map when we zoom in what would be the Sahara is the fact that there's no Sahara once again, but there is a mention of the desert. So here we see Africa Deserto, which means the desert of Africa, but once again very small. You can see, outposts, river here, mountain chains, and the desert is just very small compared to what we've seen in other maps. So really the question we have to ask ourselves is just how smaller was the Sahara at this time in history. But that's not it. Let's get into the details of what this map actually shows, because the map of Sebastian Munster has more things to talk about than just the Sahara Desert lacking, and there's more. So one thing I was very interested in was this Regnum Orguene. By the way, yeah, that is how you pronounce this word. It's not regnum, it's regnum, because it's Latin. And this Regnum Orguene, what is that? So I had to do a little bit of digging, and I finally found the answer to the question. Apparently, the Kingdom of Orguene, Regnum means kingdom, seems to be a native kingdom inhabited by the people of modern-day Benin and southern Nigeria. It was also called Ogane, and its capital laid in what is now Ife, in southwestern Nigeria. So there has been a state in history called the Ife Empire. So according to the people that, try to interpret the sources of the Portuguese, the Kingdom of Orguene, as shown right here, was in fact something akin this, the Ife Empire. Nowadays, this theory has been put into question, as it seems the identification of the Kingdom of Orguene with the city of Ife was a modern far-fetched appeasement and malinterpretation of Portuguese sources that clearly identified the city as being much more into the interior of Africa than it was possibly shown in the Ife Empire. So what is this saying is that Ife, so this place right here, was not the Kingdom of Orguene. Instead, Kingdom of Orguene would be far into the interior of Africa and would be in northeastern Nigeria, maybe, so somewhere around here. or maybe next to the Niger River, since, you know, it's closer in the geographic sense. Either way, this regnum or Gwene has no traces in history. It doesn't appear to have any other sources to, you know, corroborate its claim, but there's definitely something to it. And I had no idea it existed, honestly, before I went into this map. Next to the regnum of Gwene, we have something called Nubia regnum. Nubia or Nubia is a very well-known place. As you can see here, Nubia is shown in the map. Nubia is right under Egypt. In case you've never heard of Nubia, this is where the Kushites were from. The people that, in the far, far past, conquered Egypt and brought dark-skinned people into the Egyptian crown and the pharaonic rulers. So this is where the dark-skinned, like actually dark-skinned, Sudanese people of Egypt come from. And the kingdom of Nubia was not really one thing. So it's often designated as a historical misconception, basically. Because while we can see a single Nubia regnum in this map, we actually know that this was not the case in the time that the map was made. Although it's possible that this map is referring to a far earlier period where Nubia was unified under a single dynasty or kingdom, we know that is not the case in that period. In fact, a very interesting part about Nubian history and African history is that Christianity, in fact, arrived to this area way earlier than parts of Europe and the rest of Africa. In fact, Nubia was what united Egypt to Ethiopia. And if you know anything about Egypt, is that Egypt is the home of the Copts. The Coptic faith being part of the Christian faith, and it used to be the easternmost version of it. But after the Arab invasions, and what happened with the Rashidun Caliphate that brought Islam into all of North Africa, Christianity, Coptic Christianity, became a small minority in Egypt, although it took many centuries to reach that point. That meant that Nubia and Ethiopia would have a lot of Christians that were separated from the rest of the Christian world, which relayed mainly in Europe and parts of North Africa. But this didn't mean that the Christians just died out in Nubia or Ethiopia. In fact, Nubia held two kingdoms that were completely Christian. These were the kingdoms of Makuria and the kingdom of Alwa, also called the kingdom of Alodia. The kingdom of Alodia had its capital in the city of Meroe, while the kingdom of Makuria had it in Napata. There's also an easternmost kingdom called the Regnum of Habeth in this map, also identified with the kingdom of the Blemmyes, which were an ancient people, and this kingdom was not Christian. But Alwa and Makuria were. But what happened to these two kingdoms? Unfortunately, this history was not as lucky as Ethiopia. In fact, while Ethiopia remained basically independent for the majority of its history, under various dynasties, various kingdoms, but still independent, this was not the case for Nubia. In fact, when the Arabs finished the conquest of North Africa and started expanding into West Africa, they also started very slowly expanding into Sudan. Sudan, in fact, being the same thing as Nubia basically, while a bit more large, is where the places like Meroe, Nubia, and Khartoum were located. First, the kingdom of Makuria was conquered by the Muslims. And then, in 1506, the last Nubian kingdom ruled by Christians and inhabited by them was conquered by the Funj dynasty of the kingdom of Sennar, another Islamic state, and therefore Alwa also fell. That meant that by the time this map was made, Nubia was not even a kingdom, and it was not even a Christian state. But maybe this map still identified it as much, since the information of the fall of the Christian kingdoms in Nubia probably didn't reach Europe yet. Then we go to Ethiopia. So, an interesting fact about Ethiopia that I've already discussed very far and very deeply in the past is the concept of Prester John's kingdom. Now, I've made plenty of videos mentioning Prester John's kingdom, so I'm not gonna detail it too much here. You can go watch one of them, I'll put them in the description. I made one part of it during my Beyond the Ice Wall series, and then another part during my Lost Lands, something like that series, my second iceberg video, that's it. So you can go watch that if you want to know more about Prester John, but the short version of it is that it was a Christian kingdom in Africa, similar to the Nubian ones, And there was a legendary figure called Prester John, which was to be some sort of like militaristic saint figure that protected the people of the area and defended them from the Islamic conquerors. And during the times of the Mongol Empire and the Crusades, there were calls for the people of Prester John to link up with the Crusaders that invaded the Levant to defeat Islam once and for all. There was a whole prophecy about this. And although this never came to be, there was still a faith that in this part of Africa there lived, some kind of Prester John that ruled over this huge kingdom of Christians. And while that was a bit far-fetched at the time, it's definitely true in part, since Ethiopia, which was indeed a Christian monarchy, was alive and well at the time, and it was indeed a Christian state. Although, as we can see here, we don't really have like a kingdom of Ethiopia, because Ethiopia was just a word used for this entire area, not just a country, you know? And although Ethiopia had different dynasties and states, they didn't really know what they were called at the time. Next to Ethiopia, we have the Regnum Melinde, which was an actual polity that existed at the time, called the Kingdom of Melinda. And the Kingdom of Melinda was actually a coastal state. In fact, the reason why it's so inland in this map is probably because the Portuguese that reached its coast didn't really know how far into the land it extended to. So they probably guessed that it extended to all the way to the Lake Victoria, which I assume this is what it is. So another interesting thing about this map is that it shows what is called the Mountain of the Moon. This mountain chain right here doesn't actually exist. And this is not something that you can really have a controversial opinion on in history. They simply are not there. There is no large mountain chains that actually make the Nile River develop. In fact, in the ancient times, and this went on in the medieval times and all the way into the modern era, before they actually tried to go from the top of the Nile River in the Nile Delta all the way to the bottom, they never actually knew where the Nile started from. So they kind of just invented a mountain chain in the middle of Africa that had to, just give the water to make the river go all the way there. And in this case, this kind of myth was created that there were some mountains that were called the Mountains of the Moon that, just fueled the Nile River. And they said there were two sources that made the White Nile and the Blue Nile, which is what the Nile River is divided by. And under these mountain chains, there lived more kingdoms and more people. In this case, we have the Kingdom of Quiola, or Quiola Regnum. I could not find any information on this. I could think this might be the Kingdom of Monmotapa, which was an actual polity in modern-day Zimbabwe, but there is no evidence that this is what we are talking about, so I'm not going to dwell too much into it. What I'm gonna say is just how bare bones the knowledge of southern tip of Africa was at the time. As you can see, there's like an elephant here, it just says Africae Extremitas, which is Africa Extremitas, and that just means the end of Africa, basically. So yeah, but they did say that this was the Capue Bona Fé, which means basically the Cape of Good Hope, as was called when the Portuguese arrived and set up the outpost. Of course, we even have the Regnum de Ceylon, which is the Kingdom of Somalia. Although this was not really united at the time, it was indeed a polity that existed, although it was not really called like this, in fact Somalia being another exonym. And then we go to another very interesting thing, which is this guy. Monokuli, which means literally one-eyed guy. Yeah, it just means one eye. And if you're wondering why there's a Cyclops on the map, well, that's a whole other deal, and I think the explanation is simply that in the past, people really believed that there were these one-eyed creatures that lived in the world, and every time they found a skeleton of an elephant, where the central part of the skull of an elephant looks exactly like a human skull with one eye, they just thought, oh, well, that's Cyclops. So Africa being full of elephants really explains why they thought the Monokuli were here. And if you really want to talk about something interesting, we should talk about the fact that the Blemmyes, which we mentioned earlier, Blemmyes, as seen here, they actually thought that they have no head, but just a body, and in the body there was a face. And that's what the Beyond the Ice Walls, the first series, kind of talked about compared to what this map shows, but this map doesn't even really show that. It shows a Cyclops, but it doesn't show the headless people, so that's interesting. Then we go to what is known as Western Africa. Here I think it's kind of accurate for the time. The people of Portugal and Iberia had a lot of more contacts with this part of Africa than the rest, and they kind of understood what was going on, with the only really interesting thing being this mountain chain right here, which is not really there. It's just not there. There's no real mountain chain that goes through what is nowadays Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, or at least not like a very noticeable one. Like there might be some hills and stuff covered by a lush vegetation, but nothing that you can really call like a mountain chain, as in Morocco or you know, Ethiopia or the mountains of the moon. So yeah, that's very interesting. Then we have the Kingdom of Senegal, the Kingdom of Guinea. This is the Regnum Mali, which I think is very interesting, that the Kingdom of Mali, which is by the way what the Regnum Mali means, was intended as this into the continent, which meant that they didn't really know how far into the continent they got to when exploring this area, because if we go north of here we can see that they had something called Libya Interior, which just means the interior part of Libya, which once again you have to be reminded that means Africa. So we just have an area that we call Libya Interior that doesn't really mean anything, and this is where it gets crazy. And it's bordering the Lacus Libyae, the Lake of Libya, the Lake of Africa. So there's many interpretations you can have about this Lacus Libyae. I think the most rational would be that this is Lake Chad. This is Lake Chad in Africa, very well known lake, and it used to be way larger in the past, which might mean in this case it was reduced because it was already smaller. But then that would kind of like clash with the whole Libya Desertum thing, with the fact that we have a small desert, and then we have a forest in Libya near the Lacus Libyae. So the idea would be that this is Lake Chad, and next to it is the lush Greenland area that has to do with Lake Chad, which is by the way in the country of Chad nowadays, even if parts of it are in Cameroon and Nigeria, as shown as in this map. It's right here. And then there comes the issue of why is Libya Desertum south of Lake Chad, while we know that the Sahara is north of Lake Chad. So once again, very, very interesting stuff that we don't really have an explanation for, but we can have theories for, and those theories have to do with the desertification of the Sahara. So in case you don't know, up to 5,000 years ago, only 5,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was a green, lush land filled with vegetation and huge lakes. Lake Chad was over 8 times larger than it used to be. This is what the Sahara looked like only 5,000 years ago, a bit earlier if you get to this amount, but even after, still looked like this. Only around 3,000 before the birth of Christ, you really start to see the desertification process start, and this area that used to be once again very lush starts becoming a savanna habitat. And that really started to ruin what the people that lived here were doing, which actually kind of started the whole moving into Egypt thing. So this is when the native Africans that lived here started moving into Egypt and into northern Africa, and became respectively the Egyptians and the Berbers of North Africa, while the rest that were cut off by the Sahara moved south. So I find it very interesting that this map, and this one even, that shows so many lakes, kind of relate to the actual historical event of the desertification of the Sahara, and the fact that there were so many more lakes and rivers here than they used to be in those times. So I've seen many sources that say that this was kind of like a moment of collective consciousness of a historical event, like brought on generation by generation, generation after generation, by simply talking to their children about how once this area used to be a lush green land, a flat land that you could grow crops in, and it was fertile, and then suddenly it was destroyed. And that is maybe why there's a forest here in this map, because the sources of the natives might still be referring to that. Although this can't be for sure, we still have to explain somehow why the sudden forest has appeared on the map. So the last thing I really want to mention in this video is what is shown right here, the Niger Palus. So Palus means usually something across a lake, and area palustre, which basically means a swamp. So according to this map, the area that connects the Lacus Libyae to the Niger Palus is a swamp. But then if the Lacus Libyae is the Lake Chad, what is the swamp? Where is that? And here is where the interesting theory comes in. Basically, we do know that there is something of a circular structure, circular geographic entity in modern-day Mauritania. And what this is called is the Eye of the Sahara, shown in here. This is not some random picture, this is what it looks like from space if it was filled with water. And then there's the question. Nobody really knows if it was filled with water at some point in time. People think that this is what Atlantis actually used to look like. And if we see in these other maps, once again we have it here, and here we have it here. You could even say that maybe this entire thing is the Eye of the Sahara. Depending on the map, it could be that, it could be this, could be anything, honestly. We do know that this existed, but it wasn't filled with water, unless it was. So the structure without water exists even today, but if it really was filled with water, of course it would be represented as it in maps. But then that begs the question, why was this not called Atlantis? Or some memory of it could have been continued in time, as with the entire thing of the desertification of the Sahara. I think both of these can be very, very interesting in their own regard, because depending on what you believe, this could either be the Sahara desert just not being as big as it was, or the Sahara desert being as big as it was, but the knowledge of it not being enough to explain all of it, but parts of the pre-Sahara knowledge still being there. And, you know, the Atlantis here thing is also linked up with the whole desertification of the Sahara deal, because people believe that for Atlantis, or for the Eye of the Sahara, to actually have water, it needed to have higher sea levels, but most importantly, more green, more lushlands, more vegetation. And to have that, more precipitation, of course, that's the main thing, more precipitation, so rain, more storms, more clouds. And that was not the case later. So is it possible that during the expansion of the Sahara, which according to, you know, just history and what we know, happened between 3000 BCE to now, what was once Atlantis was covered in sand, and the memory of it still existed in maps and what people thought of the area, but they did not call it in a different way, just calling it in this case the Niger Palus, so basically the swamp of Niger. And that also begs another question, why is it called a swamp? Is it possible that this was a transitional phase between the simply Eye of the Sahara as in Atlantis, as in lush civilization, green, into a lake, a swamp, a desert, and then later just part of the Sahara? That could be it. That could be it, or maybe not. I don't know. These are theories. What I find interesting about this map is that it poses a lot of questions, a lot of unanswered questions, and the more you dig in, the more questions it gives you. So that is just honestly very, very interesting to me. Also, one last thing, we can see that the area of Arabia is divided in three in this map, as used to be in medieval and modern history. We have Arabia Deserta, Arabia Petrea, and Arabia Felix, which are respectively the Happy Arabia, as it was called, as in Fertile Arabia, which was basically modern-day Yemen, or at least parts of it. Then Arabia Petrea, which was basically the area where Hejaz is, and of course the Mecca and Medina are, and then Arabia Deserta, so the deserts of northern Arabia. So I just wanted to mention that because, you know, they did have knowledge of what Arabia was like, so how come Africa is so different from nowadays? And that's where I'll end things today. I hope you guys were interested by this video, and that it prompted you to do more research on this area. And if you know anything that I don't know, or that I didn't mention in this video, let me know in the comments what else you could find on this topic. And I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed the video, and my normal upload schedule of videos will slowly start again. Hopefully one video each week or each 2 weeks, so you can actually enjoy more of my content without having to wait months for it. And that's gonna be it from Italian PNC now and today, and see you all in my next video. Goodbye.